Hello, book lovers. Welcome to session 10 of the guided reading of Anne Brontë's Agnes Grey. I hope you're enjoying this literary journey with me. I have to say, this is the first time that I'm reading Agnes Grey, so I'm going on this journey with you guys, and I'm really enjoying it. I have to say, I like it much more than Charlotte Bronte's The Professor that we read earlier this year. What do you think about these two different texts by two different Bronte sisters? Charlotte is a favorite of mine, right? I love Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is one of my favorite books ever. But when comparing The Professor and Agnes Grey is my favorite so far, at least. So we're going to continue our reading today. We're going to read chapters 18, called Mirth and Mourning. Two opposites with starting with the same letter, mirth and mourning. So that's a nice assonance there. And chapter 19 called The Letter. But before we do that, let's take a step back and revise what we discussed in session 9. So in session 9, which was a very interesting one, we read chapters 16 and 17, right? Chapter 16 called The Substitution. And now we have come to understand the character of Rosalie Murray more. She's a very vain girl. She loves to be adored. She loves the attention. And she was having a great time with Mr. Hatfield, the rector, leading him on, being admired and, seducing him, charming him, until he proposed marriage to her. And that's what she wanted all along, right? But then she had that whole theatrical reaction, feeling outraged that someone from Mr. Hatfield's social ranks, only a rector, right, would have the courage or the audacity to ask a lady in marriage. So she rejects him, and she has pleasure in rejecting him. And now she wants to do it again. So in the chapter called The Substitution, she substitutes the target of her attention. And to Agnes' dismay, Rosalie, she has set her eyes on Mr. Weston. So in The Substitution, Rosalie has a new target, Mr. Weston, and she comes up with a plan to go with Matilda, her sister, and without Agnes, to a place where Mr. Weston is expected, so then she can charm him. And chapter 17, Confessions, is one of my favorites so far. And that's because we have a deeper understanding of Agnes's feelings, hence the title, Confessions. She opens up her heart, and she writes about beauty as a gift from God, and how those who have beauty don't use it well. She is in love with Mr. Weston. She's quite frank about that. She confesses her love. And it pains her to see what Rosalie is up to. Sir Thomas Ashby proposed to Rosalie. So that's what she wanted, right? A marriage that would elevate her socially. So she will become Lady Ashby of Ashby Park. But she's not interested in him as a person, not at all. And she wants to keep her engagement a secret for as long as possible, so that she could still use her charms to seduce men before she's incapacitated. And that's the word used in the novel, incapacitated by marriage. So that's where we left off last time. So let's begin with chapter 18, called Mirth and Mourning. Get your copy of the book. Someone has asked me about the edition that I'm using. So I have this edition from the Modern Library Classics, and it has an introduction and notes by Barbara Suis. I like to have academic editions that include notes and extra material, such as an introduction. So this one, this is the one that I found from the Modern Library Classics. All right, so get your copy of Agnes Grey, get your cup of coffee or tea, and let's read together. The 1st of June arrived at last, and Rosalie Murray was transmuted into Lady Ashby. Most splendidly beautiful she looked in her bridal costume. Upon her return from church after the ceremony, she came flying into the schoolroom, flushed with excitement and laughing, half in mirth and half in reckless desperation, as it seemed to me. "Now, Miss Grey, I'm Lady Ashby," she exclaimed. "It's done. My fate is sealed. There's no drawing back now. I'm come to receive your congratulations and bid you goodbye, and then I'm off for Paris, Rome, Naples, Switzerland, London. Oh dear, what a deal I shall see and hear before I come back again. But don't forget me. I shan't forget you, though I've been a naughty girl. Come, why don't you congratulate me?" "I cannot congratulate you," I replied, "till I know whether this change is really for the better. But I sincerely hope it is, and I wish you true happiness and the best of blessings." "Well, goodbye. The carriage is waiting, and they're calling me." She gave me a hasty kiss and was hurrying away, but suddenly returning, embraced me with more affection than I thought her capable of evincing, and departed with tears in her eyes. Poor girl! I really loved her then, and forgave her from my heart all the injury she had done me, and others also. She had not half known it, I was sure, and I prayed God to pardon her too. During the remainder of that day of festal sadness, I was left to my own devices. Being too much unhinged for any steady occupation, I wandered about with a book in my hand for several hours. More thinking than reading, for I had many things to think about, and in the evening I made use of my liberty to go and see my old friend Nancy once again. To apologize for my long absence, which must have seemed so neglectful and unkind, by telling her how busy I had been, and to talk, or read, or work for her, whichever might be most acceptable, and also, of course, to tell her the news of this important day, and perhaps to obtain a little information from her in return respecting Mr. Weston's expected departure. But of this she seemed to know nothing, and I hoped, as she did, that it was all a false report. She was very glad to see me, but happily her eyes were now so nearly well that she was almost independent of my services. She was deeply interested in the wedding, but while I amused her with the details of the festive day, the splendors of the bridal party, and of the bride herself, she often sighed and shook her head, and wished good might come of it. She seemed like me to regard it rather as a theme for sorrow than rejoicing. I sat a long time talking to her about that and other things, but no one came. Shall I confess that I sometimes looked towards the door with a half-expectant wish to see it open and give entrance to Mr. Weston, as had happened once before, and that, returning through the lanes and fields, I often paused to look round me, and walked more slowly than was at all necessary, for though a fine evening, it was not a hot one, and finally felt a sense of emptiness and disappointment at having reached the house without meeting or even catching a distant glimpse of anyone, except a few laborers returning from their work. Sunday, however, was approaching. I should see him then, for now that Miss Murray was gone, I could have my old corner again. I should see him, and by look, speech, and manner I might judge whether the circumstance of her marriage had very much afflicted him. Happily I could perceive no shadow of a difference. He wore the same aspect as he had worn 2 months ago. Voice, look, manner, all alike unchanged. There was the same keen-sighted, unclouded truthfulness in his discourse, the same forcible clearness in his style, the same earnest simplicity in all he said and did, that made itself not marked by the eye and ear, but felt upon the hearts of his audience. I walked home with Miss Matilda, but he did not join us. Matilda was now sadly at a loss for amusement and woefully in want of a companion. Her brothers at school, her sister married and gone, she too young to be admitted into society, for which, from Rosalie's example, she was in some degree beginning to acquire a taste at least for the company of certain classes of gentlemen. At this dull time of the year, no hunting going on, no shooting even, for though she might not join in that, it was something to see her father or the gamekeeper go out with the dogs, and to talk with them on their return about the different birds they had bagged. Now also she was denied the solace which the companionship of the coachman, groom, horses, greyhounds, and pointers might have afforded. For her mother, having notwithstanding the disadvantages of a country life so satisfactorily disposed of her elder daughter, the pride of her heart, had begun seriously to turn her attention to the younger, and being truly alarmed at the roughness of her manners, and thinking it high time to work a reform, had been roused at length to exert her authority and prohibited entirely the yards, stables, kennels, and coach-house. Of course she was not implicitly obeyed, but indulgent as she had hitherto been, when once her spirit was roused, her temper was not so gentle as she required that of her governesses to be, and her will was not to be thwarted with impunity. And after many a scene of contention between mother and daughter, many a violent outbreak which I was ashamed to witness, in which the father's authority was often called in to confirm, with oaths and threats, the mother's slighted prohibitions, for even he could see that Tiffy, though he would have made a fine lad, was not quite what a young lady ought to be. Matilda at length found that her easiest plan was to keep clear of forbidden regions, unless she could now and then steal a visit without her watchful mother's knowledge. Amid all this, let it not be imagined that I escaped without many a reprimand, and many an implied reproach that lost none of its sting from not being openly warded, but rather wounded the more deeply, because from that very reason it seemed to preclude self-defense. Frequently I was told to amuse Miss Matilda with other things, and to remind her of her mother's precepts and prohibitions. I did so to the best of my power, but she would not be amused against her will, and could not against her taste, and though I went beyond mere reminding, such gentle remonstrances as I could use were utterly ineffectual. Dear Miss Grey, it is the strangest thing. I suppose you can help it, if it's not in your nature, but I wonder you can't win the confidence of that girl and make your society at least as agreeable to her as that of Robert or Joseph. They can talk the best about the things in which she is most interested, I replied. Well, that is a strange confession, however, to come from her governess. Who is to form our young lady's tastes? I wonder if the governess doesn't do it. I have known governesses who have so completely identified themselves with the reputation of their young ladies for elegance and propriety in mind and manners that they would blush to speak a word against them, and to hear the slightest blame imputed to their pupils was worse than to be censured in their own persons, and I really think it very natural for my part. Do you, ma'am? Yes, of course, the young lady's proficiency and elegance is of more consequence to the governess than her own, as well as to the world. If she wishes to prosper in her vocation, she must devote all her energies to her business. All her ideas and all her ambition will tend to the accomplishment of that one object. When we wish to decide upon the merits of a governess, we naturally look at the young ladies she professes to have educated, and judge accordingly. The judicious governess knows this. She knows that, while she lives in obscurity herself, her pupils' virtues and defects will be open to every eye, and that unless she loses sight of herself in their cultivation, she need not hope for success. You see, Miss Grey, it is just the same as any other trade or profession. They that wish to prosper must devote themselves body and soul to their calling, and if they begin to yield to indolence or self-indulgence, they are speedily distanced by wiser competitors. There is little to choose between a person that ruins her pupils by neglect and one that corrupts them by her example. You will excuse my dropping these little hints. You know it is all for your own good. Many ladies would speak to you much more strongly, and many would not trouble themselves to speak at all, but quietly look out for a substitute. That, of course, would be the easiest plan, but I know the advantages of a place like this to a person in your situation, and I have no desire to part with you, as I'm sure you would do very well if you will only think of these things and try to exert yourself a little more. And then I am convinced you would soon acquire the delicate tact which alone is wanting to give you a proper influence over the mind of your pupil. Now, what a lecture! Hmm? So Mrs. Murray is telling Agnes that she should do more. She should devote herself entirely to her pupils, that her own existence does not care, does not is not worth it. There is no value to her existence, to herself or to the world. The world doesn't care about her. The world sees her through her pupils. So if her pupils thrive, then it is she thrives as well, right? So she does not exist as an individual person, as Agnes Grey. She is the governess. Can you imagine? I was about to give the lady some idea of the fallacy of her expectations, but she sailed away as soon as she had concluded her speech. Having said what she wished, it was no part of her plan to await any answer. It was my business to hear and not to speak. However, as I have said, Matilda at length yielded in some degree to her mother's authority. Pity had not been exerted before, and being thus deprived of almost every source of amusement, there was nothing for it but to take long rides with the groom and long walks with the governess, and to visit the cottages and farmhouses on her father's estate to kill time in chatting with the old men and women that inhabited them. In one of these walks, it was our chance to meet Mr. Weston. This was what I had long desired, but now for a moment I wished either he or I were away. I felt my heart throb so violently that I dreaded lest some outward signs of emotion should appear. But I think he hardly glanced at me, and I was soon calm enough. After a brief salutation to both, he asked Matilda if she had lately heard from her sister. Yes, replied she. She was at Paris when she wrote, and very well and very happy. She spoke the last word emphatically, and with a glance impertinently sly. He did not seem to notice it, but replied with equal emphasis and very seriously, I hope she will continue to be so. Do you think it likely? I ventured to inquire, for Matilda had started off in pursuit of her dog that was chasing a leveret. I cannot tell, replied he. Sir Thomas may be a better man than I may suppose, but from all I have heard and seen, it seems a pity that one so young and gay and interesting, to express many things by one whose greatest, if not her only fault, appears to be thoughtlessness. No trifling fault, to be sure, since it renders the possessor liable to almost every other, and exposes him to so many temptations. But it seems a pity that she should be thrown away on such a man. It was her mother's wish, I suppose? Yes, and her own too, I think, for she always laughed at my attempts to dissuade her from the step. You did attempt it. Then at least you will have the satisfaction of knowing that it is no fault of yours, if any harm should come of it. As for Mrs. Murray, I don't know how she can justify her conduct. If I had sufficient acquaintance with her, I'd ask her. It seems unnatural, but some people think rank and wealth the chief good, and if they can secure that to their children, they think they have done their duty. True. But is it not strange that persons of experience, who have been married themselves, should judge so falsely? Matilda now came panting back, with the lacerated body of the young hare in her hand. Was it your intention to kill that hare or to save it, Miss Murray? Asked Mr. Weston, apparently puzzled at her gleeful countenance. I pretended to want to save it, she answered honestly enough, as it was so glaringly out of season, but I was better pleased to see it killed. However, you can both witness that I couldn't help it. Prince was determined to have her, and he clutched her by the back and killed her in a minute. Wasn't it a noble chase? Very, for a young lady after a leveret. There was a quiet sarcasm in the tone of his reply, which was not lost upon her. She shrugged her shoulders and, turning away with a significant asked me how I had enjoyed the fun. I replied that I saw no fun in the matter, but admitted that I had not observed the transaction very narrowly. Didn't you see how it doubled, just like an old hare? And didn't you hear it scream? I'm happy to say I did not. It cried out just like a child. Poor little thing. What will you do with it? Come along. I shall leave it in the first house we come to. I don't want to take it home, for fear Papa should scold me for letting the dog kill it. Mr. Weston was now gone, and we two went on our way. But as we returned, after having deposited the hare in a farmhouse and demolished some spice cake and currant wine in exchange, we met him returning also from the execution of his mission, whatever it might be. He carried in his hand a cluster of beautiful bluebells, which he offered to me, observing with a smile that though he had seen so little of me for the last 2 months, he had not forgotten that bluebells were numbered among my favorite flowers. It was done as a simple act of goodwill, without compliment or remarkable courtesy, or any look that could be construed into reverential, tender adoration, vide Rosalie Murray. But still it was something to find my unimportant saying so well remembered. It was something that he had noticed so accurately the time I had ceased to be visible. I was told, said he, that you were a perfect bookworm, Miss Grey, so completely absorbed in your studies that you were lost to every other pleasure. Yes, and it's quite true, cried Matilda. No, Mr. Weston, don't believe it. It's a scandalous libel. These young ladies are too fond of making random assertions at the expense of their friends, and you ought to be careful how you listen to them. I hope this assertion is groundless, at any rate. Why? Do you particularly object to ladies studying? No, but I object to anyone so devoting himself or herself to study as to lose sight of everything else. Except under peculiar circumstances, I consider very close and constant study as a waste of time and an injury to the mind as well as the body. Well, I have neither the time nor the inclination for such transgressions. We parted again. Well, what is there remarkable in all this? Why have I recorded it? Because, reader, it was important enough to give me a cheerful evening, a night of pleasing dreams, and a morning of felicitous hopes. I love it when she interrupts the narrative as the narrator to talk directly to the reader. Because, reader, it was important enough to give me a cheerful evening, a night of pleasing dreams, and a morning of felicitous hopes. Shallow-brained cheerfulness, foolish dreams, unfounded hopes, you would say, and I will not venture to deny it. Suspicion to that effect arose too frequently in my own mind, but our wishes are like tinder. The flint and steel of circumstances are continually striking out sparks, which vanish immediately, unless they chance to fall upon the tinder of our wishes. Then they instantly ignite, and the flame of hope is kindled in that moment. But alas, that very morning my flickering flame of hope was dismally quenched by a letter from my mother, which spoke so seriously of my father's increasing illness that I feared there was little or no chance of his recovery. And, close at hand as the holidays were, I almost trembled lest they should come too late for me to meet him in this world. 2 days after, a letter from Mary told me his life was despaired of, and his end seemed fast approaching. Then immediately I sought permission to anticipate the vacation and go without delay. Mrs. Murray stared and wondered at the unwonted energy and boldness with which I urged the request, and thought there was no occasion to hurry, but finally gave me leave, stating, however, that there was no need to be in such agitation about the matter. It might prove a false alarm after all, and if not, why, it was only in the common course of nature. We must all die sometime, and I was not to suppose myself the only afflicted person in the world. And concluding with saying I might have the phaeton to take me to O. And instead of repining, Miss Grey, be thankful for the privileges you enjoy. There's many a poor clergyman whose family would be plunged into ruin by the event of his death. But you see, have influential friends ready to continue their patronage and to show you every consideration. I thanked her for her consideration, in quotation marks, and flew to my room to make some hurried preparations for my departure. My bonnet and shawl being on, and a few things hastily crammed into my largest trunk, I descended. But I might have done the work more leisurely, for no one else was in a hurry, and I had still a considerable time to wait for the phaeton. Phaeton is a type of carriage, right? So she could be taken there quicker. So, a privilege. At length it came to the door, and I was off. But oh, what a dreary journey was that! How utterly different from my former passages homewards! Being too late for the last coach to the place, I had to hire a cab for 10 miles and then a car to take me over the rugged hills. It was 10:30 before I reached home. They were not in bed. So her journey, she had to take a coach, then a cab. So this is some interesting contextual information. A coach is a large closed carriage with four wheels. So it is kind of, maybe we could compare it to a bus nowadays. So she was too late to take the last coach. So this large closed carriage that would take people from one place to another, and you would pay for it. So she had to hire a cab. And a cab was a one-horse vehicle available for public hire, but of course much more expensive. And then a car to take me over the rugged hills. And a car probably refers to a light four-wheeled carriage. So it took a long time, and she had to spend a lot of money to get home. And when she arrived, they were not in bed. My mother and sister both met me in the passage, sad, silent, pale. I was so much shocked and terror-stricken I could not speak to ask the information I so much longed yet dreaded to obtain. Agnes, said my mother, struggling to repress some strong emotion. Oh, Agnes, cried Mary, and burst into tears. How is he? I asked, gasping for the answer. Dead. It was the reply I had anticipated, but the shock seemed none the less tremendous. Well, this is a chapter of contrasts, right? As the title suggests, mirth and mourning. Mirth and mourning. First of all, Rosalie's wedding was an event of both mirth and mourning because she's happy to have become Lady Ashby, but also Agnes, and I think Rosalie herself, they are already anticipating the sadness which will overtake her once all the traveling is done and she settles down as the lady of the manor in Ashby Park and really begins her life married to Lord Ashby, because he does not seem like a nice person, quite contrary. So it will not be a very pleasant life as she had expected. So she's mourning that, although she's happy right now, she's mourning that her youth is gone, her her chance to charm other men and to be jolly and young, that's past. And also for Agnes, there's a period of mirth and mourning. Mirth because she has had another conversation with Mr. Weston. He remembered that she likes bluebells, and she's full, for a moment, temporarily, she's filled with hope and silly dreams. She calls them silly, but it's a lover's dreams and hopes. But then it's all those sparks are destroyed by the arrival of a letter informing her of her father's illness, and when she arrives home, it's too late, so she's mourning her father. Wow, right? Let's carry on and read chapter 19, called The Letter. My friends My father's mortal remains had been consigned to the tomb, and we, with set faces and somber garments, sat lingering over the frugal breakfast table, revolving plans for our future life. My mother's strong mind had not given way beneath even this affliction. Her spirit, though crushed, was not broken. Mary's wish was that I should go back to Horton Lodge, and that our mother should come and live with her and Mr. Richardson at the vicarage. She affirmed that he wished it no less than herself, and that such an arrangement could not fail to benefit all parties, for my mother's society and experience would be of inestimable value to them, and they would do all they could to make her happy. But no arguments or entreaties could prevail. My mother was determined not to go. Not that she questioned for a moment the kind wishes and intentions of her daughter, but she affirmed that so long as God spared her health and strength, she would make use of them to earn her own livelihood and be chargeable to no one, whether her dependence would be felt as a burden or not. If she could afford to reside as a lodger in the vicarage, she would choose that house before all others as the place of her abode. But not being so circumstanced, she would never come under its roof except as an occasional visitor, unless sickness or calamity should render her assistance really needful, or until age or infirmity made her incapable of maintaining herself. No, Mary, said she, if Richardson and you have anything to spare, you must lay it aside for your family, and Agnes and I must gather honey for ourselves. Thanks to my having had daughters to educate, I have not forgotten my accomplishments. God willing, I will check this vain repining, she said, while the tears coursed one another down her cheeks in spite of her efforts. But she wiped them away, and resolutely shaking back her head, continued, I will exert myself and look out for a small house commodiously situated in some populous but healthy district, where we will take a few young ladies to board and educate, if we can get them, and as many day pupils as will come, or as we can manage to instruct. Your father's relations and old friends will be able to send us some pupils or to assist us with their recommendations, no doubt. I shall not apply to my own. What say you to it, Agnes? Will you be willing to leave your present situation and try? So what her mother plans to do is to rent a house and take a few young ladies to board and educate. There is a note here. And this is in relation to the context of the Brontes themselves. The Bronte sisters themselves attempted such a scheme in 1844, but it never got off the ground. So this was a common way for women to earn money, so to open a kind of school, right, a home school. So you would get pupils, students who would board and study there. So they would pay for accommodations, food, and study. So that was a way for them to make a living, to afford a place to live, and to have some money to carry on. So she wants Agnes to terminate her employment at Horton Lodge and start this boarding and education house for girls. Quite willing, Mamma, and the money I have saved will do to furnish the house. It shall be taken from the bank directly, when it is wanted. We must get the house and settle all preliminaries first. Mary offered to lend the little she possessed, but my mother declined it, saying that we must begin on an economical plan, and she hoped that a whole or part of mine, added to what we could get by the sale of the furniture, and what little our dear papa had contrived to lay aside for her since the debts were paid, would be sufficient to last us until Christmas, when it was hoped something would accrue from our united labors. It was finally settled that this should be our plan, and that inquiries and preparations should immediately be set on foot. And while my mother busied herself with these, I should return to Horton Lodge at the close of my 4 weeks' vacation, and give notice for my final departure when things were in train for the speedy commencement of our school. We were discussing these affairs on the morning I have mentioned, about a fortnight after my father's death, when a letter was brought in for my mother, on beholding which the colour mounted to her face, lately pale enough with anxious watchings and excessive sorrow. "From my father," murmured she, as she hastily tore off the cover. It was many years since she had heard from any of her own relations before. Naturally wondering what the letter might contain, I watched her countenance while she read it, and was somewhat surprised to see her bite her lip and knit her brows as if in anger. When she had done, she somewhat irreverently cast it on the table, saying with a scornful smile, "Your grandpapa has been so kind as to write to me. He says he has no doubt I have long repented of my unfortunate marriage, and if I will only acknowledge this, and confess I was wrong in neglecting his advice, and that I have justly suffered for it, he will make a lady of me once again, if that be possible after my long degradation, and remember my girls in his will. Get my desk, Agnes, and send these things away. I will answer the letter directly. But first, as I may be depriving you both of a legacy, it is just that I should tell you what I mean to say. I shall say that he is mistaken in supposing that I can regret the birth of my daughters, who have been the pride of my life and are likely to be the comfort of my old age, or the 30 years I have passed in the company of my best and dearest friend, that had our misfortunes been 3 times as great as they were, unless they had been my bringing on, I should still the more rejoice to have shared them with your father, and administered what consolation I was able. And had his suffering in illness been 10 times what they were, I could not regret having watched over and labored to relieve them. That if he had married a richer wife, misfortunes and trials would no doubt have come upon him still, while I am an egotist enough to imagine that no other woman could have cheered him through them so well. Not that I am superior to the rest, but I was made for him and he for me, and I can no more repent the hours, days, years of happiness we have spent together, and which neither could have had without the other, than I can have the privilege of having been his nurse in sickness and his comfort in affliction." That's so beautiful, right? She does not regret a thing. Will this do, children? Or shall I say we are all very sorry for what has happened during the last 30 years, and my daughters wish they had never been born, but since they have had that misfortune, they will be thankful for any trifle their grandpapa will be kind enough to bestow. Of course, we both applauded our mother's resolution. Mary cleared away the breakfast things. I brought the desk. The letter was quickly written and dispatched, and from that day we heard no more of our grandfather till we saw his death announced in the newspaper a considerable time after. All his worldly possessions, of course, being left to our wealthy, unknown cousins. And that's the end of chapter 19, the letter. Look at the audacity of their mother's father, right? He writes after all those years, after having cast away their daughter for having married the man that she loved, for having degraded herself socially and financially, and he offers the possibility of redemption if she acknowledges that the past 30 years were a huge mistake and that she's sorry for that, for not having followed his advice. But she cannot do it. She cannot regret the past 30 years because she has spent those years with the man she loved. She has raised a family. She has 2 daughters that she loves. And she is honest about her feelings to her father. And he does not accept that. So those very harsh social conventions and restraints that would tear families apart. I mean, I can imagine that it still happens nowadays, but they were much stricter later on, or back in the days, right? But I feel very proud. I feel so proud reading her answer to the letters, and I'm sure her daughters would have felt the same. What do you think about Mrs. Grey's response to her father's letter? Well, I hope you've enjoyed this session. I'm very curious to know what will happen next. So now that Agnes will start school with her mother, so she has to leave Horton Lodge, meaning that she has to leave Mr. Weston? How will they say goodbye? We'll know that pretty soon. In our next session, session number 11, we'll read chapters 20 and 21. Chapter 20 is called The Farewell, and chapter 21, The School. So I will see you then. But before we close this session, if you have enjoyed this video, if you're enjoying these guided reading sessions, please leave a comment, like this video, share it with other book lovers that you know, subscribe to the channel. And I hope to see you soon in another session here or at a course at Books and Culture. Bye.